Here's the deal. Last week we got the announcement that Black Mirror will be returning for an 8th season, very likely next summer, as is typical of their release schedule in the past. But given that this channel gained a lot of popularity with my Black Mirror videos, I figured we'd go back and rediscuss some of my opinions and rankings about the Black Mirror episodes so far. As of recording and before season 8, there are 34 episodes / movies / specials that have to do with the Black Mirror universe. We're going to talk about all of them today, ranking them from worst to best. Of course, this is just my list. It's not the correct list. You're more than welcome to disagree with me in the comments section below. I would love to know what your rankings of all 34 Black Mirror episodes are. So feel free to leave a comment. Otherwise, like, share, and subscribe if this is something you're interested in, and we will hopefully see you around for more videos. But without further ado, here are all 34 episodes of Black Mirror ranked from worst to best. Number 34, Rachel, Jack, and Ashley 2. Now, this one is widely regarded as the worst episode in Black Mirror, and it's not without reason. When it came out, especially compiled with Season 5 in general, Season 5 was such a dud compared to the highs of Seasons 3 and 4, and even most of the first 2 seasons. What this episode really felt like in the moment that it came out is that Black Mirror was becoming too much of a popular thing. It was becoming kind of over-infused with typical celebrities that you'd see on other things. Obviously, this episode stars Miley Cyrus and has since launched the careers of a number of the stars in this episode. But the thing that really drops this one to the bottom of the list is that none of the characters are A, that likable, B, the technology and the story being told isn't done in a very satisfying way. We're led to be kind of on the side of Ashley O as well as Rachel Goggins, our main character. But the stories progress in a very odd way. There's a lot of time jumps between the characters because it has to in order to make the story fit. And because of that, the pacing doesn't really work. And in addition to the characters not really being that likable, one thing this episode does is really shoehorn in a lot of humor in places that Black Mirror hadn't seen as abrasively before in previous episodes. So in combination with characters, in combination with storyline, in combination with technology that just doesn't really feel great in a setting that feels less otherworldly compared to the rest of Black Mirror, I have to put this in last place. Number 33, the Waldo moment. Compiling what I just said with the previous episode, this episode really struggles with a lack of likable characters. Our main character, Jamie, is extremely unlikable, especially by the end of the episode, and it gets to a point that as you're going through watching this, other than just feeling depressed about the state of the world, which is what Black Mirror typically does, we don't really have anyone to root for or an outcome to root for at all. It's basically an election where, based on how the story progresses, what we end up cheering for at the end, or at least I do when I watch this, is for the establishment to stay in place. And at the beginning of the episode, the establishment that is in place is guilty of crimes that I won't refer to on the channel. And I don't want to vote for that, but given the alternative, it's like there isn't a happy ending here. And it isn't told in a way that makes me compelled to find a third option. It just really feels bleak, it feels unlikable, and it feels boring, which is probably the biggest crime of this episode. I think the performances by the cast in this episode are fine. I like a lot of the actors that appear in this episode. But like I said, in combination with unlikable characters and questionable storytelling in terms of its motives and its morals, I don't really know what to do with this episode, and for me, every time I watch Season 2, it's compiled by 2 fairly good episodes, and then it just ends on such a stinker. So for me, I have to put this episode way at the bottom. Number 32, Archangel. Now, very similar with Rachel, Jack, and Ashley 2, this has kind of a real-world feel in its directing, but given the fact that it was directed by Jodie Foster, I kind of expect more out of this episode. It feels very realistic. It feels like I'm in a world that I could move to California and live in on a daily basis. I think the storytelling and the progression of the story moves in a way that doesn't make us latch onto the characters. But I think, again, this is a character issue. And I know that I'm kind of sounding like a broken record at this point. I prefer the Black Mirror episodes that are character focused. And if that's not you and you're more into the technology aspect of Black Mirror, then maybe my list isn't going to agree with you in general. But especially these bottom 3 episodes, my biggest issue is with the characters and the way that the characters progress and make their decisions. I think Marie from the very beginning is a sympathetic mother, especially in the situation that she's in. But the way that she acts throughout the rest of the episode kills all that sympathy that we have for her as the audience almost off the bat. Sarah, I think, is a protagonist that we're meant to follow and we're meant to feel things for. And I think more than anything, the fact that we don't feel sympathy for her given the acting choices by the child actors in the first 2 sections of her life, I think it really detracts the story. I feel like the fact that we don't really know Sarah or don't feel for Sarah until she actually has a personality as a teenager really detracts from what this story is trying to do. And that's not necessarily an issue with the writing, or maybe it is with the directing, but it's more so an issue with having child actors and trying to tell a Bildungsroman from beginning to end. And it fails. And it's frustrating because it did fail. I think there's a lot of cool elements to this. I like the technology involved. But this episode always bores me, and it's really boring in terms of its visual style, and that's why I give the critique for Jodie Foster as the director, because it's such a boring episode to look at. But I do think it's better than the 2 below it, so that's why it sits where it does on my list. Number 31, Plaything. You guys know I'm a huge Doctor Who fan. You know I love Peter Capaldi, and I think actually Peter Capaldi is probably the best part of this episode. My biggest gripes with this episode are the fact that it's entirely told in flashbacks, and the weird, ambiguous ending. I think the way that the story is told takes away from what could otherwise be a very, very interesting character study and deep dive into a personal mental breakdown. The fact that we're hearing this story told by the protagonist, and we're meant to kind of feel like the world is falling apart around him, is great, but then by the ending, when he becomes kind of part of this antagonizing force, it really kills all the momentum that the rest of the episode had. And I don't really get this episode. And I know a lot of people do and enjoy it and like what it's trying to say about relationships and online presence. The way that it takes that story and combines it with all of the Peter Capaldi elements in terms of the technology and the way that the story ends, I don't think it's as cohesive as people think it is. I think it's a really cool story about technology told by a character and an actor that I really, really enjoy. And then when we get to that actor and that character in the present time, the story falls apart for me. Everything in the present time just feels like either an afterthought or something that wasn't completely thought out and feels like a completely different episode. So for me, taking the great bits and suffocating them with the bad bits at the end detract for me. Number 30, Smithereens. I really like Andrew Scott. I really like the acting in this episode, but to me, this feels like a low-budget version of Black Mirror. And I think the biggest issue with this episode is that it doesn't really say anything beyond technology bad. I like the character approach. I like the character study. I even like Topher Grace's appearance and the way that Topher Grace's character reacts to what's going on as kind of this Mark Zuckerberg or even Jeff Bezos stand-in. But where the story goes and how it ends in such an ambiguous way, while I like what it says about our desensitization to technology, I don't think it does the character or the story justice. I think, like the previous installment I just talked about with Plaything, it kind of derails what the rest of the story is trying to tell. It feels like the moral stance that it's taking or the story that it's trying to tell shifts in a way that is unsatisfactory. And even as much as I like the performances, I think some of the over-the-top nature of Andrew Scott's performance and the way that all the other characters react is kind of incongruous. It doesn't really mesh together very well. And so for me, when I'm watching this episode, there are a lot of really, really great moments, but a lot of not great moments that, like I said with the previous installment, suffocate it and bring it down on my overall list. I don't think it's a terrible episode, but I would like a lot of its elements more if they were told in a different way. Number 29, Bandersnatch. I forgot to mention in the previous installment that Will Poulter appears in 2 different episodes. It's the only time that's happened other than the sequel in Black Mirror. So that's cool. Colin Rittman is an interesting character, and for the life of me, I can't remember the main character of this episode's name, which tells me that he's not a very memorable character, and there's a reason for that. The main character is supposed to be a stand-in for us as the audience, and the biggest thing with Bandersnatch is you have to look at it in terms of what it is. It was kind of the first interactive film or interactive game film to be available on Netflix. And I honestly don't know that there are that many or even that many more that were created for Netflix after Bandersnatch. It was this experiment of technology that kind of fell flat. If you've never seen or you've never played Bandersnatch, Bandersnatch is a really, really long episode of Black Mirror that is basically a movie, but you have the option to choose your own adventure through it. So it effectively operates like a video game, except it's with actual filmed characters. I don't know how many thousands of endings or thousands of story options you can do. I know there's like 12 hours of content. I might be making that number up, so feel free to correct me in the comments section below. I have not played through every single one of them. Obviously, I don't have that time or that interest in this episode that much. Apart from the overall story basis and what it tries to do with Bandersnatch in universe in the actual film, this film is surrounded by a lot of really awkward elements. Like I said, the main character isn't that likable. The overall story progresses in a way that, as the player, is not how I would want the video game to turn out. I get that it's a Black Mirror episode, and a lot of it is kind of this existential crisis that Black Mirror deals with, but it's not very fun for me as the choose-your-own-adventure watcher, or as the viewer getting to figure out how this story ends. Aside from that, the technology kind of bombed upon its arrival. Everybody played it at first, and that's great, but then nobody's really talked about Bandersnatch since. And so for me, it kind of sits in this weird, awkward middle ground of this forgotten episode of Black Mirror that was cool in concept and cool upon release, but nobody has talked about in the 7 years since. Number 28, Striking Vipers. In my previous review of this episode, I talked a lot about the nature of sexuality and identity. And I don't know that I'm the right person to get into the fine details of those topics, but in terms of concept and what it tries to say about digital footprint and digital relationships, and specifically who we are in our online presence, I think it does so in a way that is really cool, and for me is easily the best episode of Season 5, despite Season 5 being easily the worst season of Black Mirror. My biggest issues with this episode come down to the acting. I'm not a huge Anthony Mackie fan, period. I thought he was underwhelming in the MCU, and every other project I've seen him on, I'm really just not that impressed with him as an actor. I'm waiting for him to just kind of have this pop-out performance. Yahya Abdul-Mateen is better, but their chemistry on screen is really awkward in a way that could do things to this story in a cool way in terms of telling the online relationship versus the in-person relationship, but we're meant to believe these guys as buddies and as online friends. You know where I'm going with that. And it never really feels that way between these two characters. Every time I watch this, there's that awkward moment when they actually have the real-life kiss. And I can't tell if they're actually trying to be awkward for the sake of the scene, or if it's just awkward and bad acting. Like the "kiss me man" line is the one that always pops up in my head. And every time I watch this episode, I just wish that the characters had performed in a different way. And so for me, like I said, it's the best episode of Season 5, but it's not all that great because Season 5 isn't a good season. So for me, that's why it sits this low. Number 27, Men Against Fire. In a lot of other lists, I see this one as the worst episode in Black Mirror, and I don't agree with that for a variety of reasons. I think this episode is ugly as sin. I don't necessarily think it's as bad as something like Rachel, Jack, and Ashley 2 or Archangel, where it's just super like brightly lit, but still really dull colors. This episode is dull, but dark, and it's done so in a way that I think is effective visually. I think the storytelling capacity and what it does with the story is great compared to some of the episodes I've ranked below it on this list. I really like the idea of kind of eugenics taking to the next level, where the people performing genocide are unable to understand that they're actually doing so because they're being tricked into not understanding what they're doing. That's a really, really cool concept. I think my biggest issue comes down to the acting in this episode. A lot of the performances are unmemorable, and I wish that more had been done with the characters in this episode. I think the technology is great. Like I said, I think the story is great. There's a really weird ending that always grows on me the more I watch it. The just awkward kind of perfect ending that this main character gets. I think his name is Stripe. The ending that Stripe gets where he is forced to visualize and make a choice in order to forget all of the sins of his past, I think is a really, really effective story, especially with the technology given. But I just wish it was performed in a different way. Number 26, Mazey Day. This is a weird episode for a lot of reasons. It was the first Black Mirror episode that really moved more into fantasy than technology. The technology in question is photography and the paparazzi as a concept in general. The episode takes place in 2006 at kind of like the height, I guess you could say, of the like mainstream magazine paparazzi model. But like the issues I've dropped below, none of the characters are that likable, especially the way that our main character acts at the very end of the episode, where instead of being sympathetic, she falls back into the paparazzi route. Mazey Day as a character is forgettable other than being an actress and teaching me how to spell Wickham in the British way. She doesn't really do much for me. And because of that, the whole werewolf thing, and it's more of a mystery that we're trying to watch and see unplay, that's cool in concept, but only the first time you watch it. Once you know what's actually happening in this episode, it's really, really boring and really, really forgettable. And it's the shortest episode in Black Mirror. And so the fact that this episode just kind of sits where it does, in terms of the non-film episodes of Black Mirror, like we talked about with Bandersnatch, I think this is easily the most forgettable episode of Black Mirror. It's the one with the werewolf. And that's all people really remember it for. And that's all they should remember it for, because it's not a very good episode. The only reason it's up as high as it is for me is because it is so short. And I like kind of what it's trying to say about the paparazzi. But beyond that, it's unsympathetic, and I don't really care for the characters in it at all. Number 25, Metalhead. Now, this might be a controversial take to put this as high as I have. I actually think Metalhead is a fairly good episode with a lot of problems. I think the biggest problems come from the fact that its story really is just the Terminator. It is the story of technology going wrong and someone having to escape from technology going wrong. And I wish there was more substance to it, but I don't know how you would give it more substance. So the reason it's as low as it is because the concept that is in play doesn't have enough to give you to push it above the placement I've given it on this list. I think visually it's fairly good looking. It's in black and white, and even with the color contrast, I think it looks fairly good. I think the main character, Bella, is likable. I like the progression of her character in this episode and the choices that she makes and just the situation that she finds herself in. I find sympathetic in a way that I think pulls the story forward, but it's a limited concept and a limited story that doesn't allow it to hit the heights of higher episodes on this list. So for me, that's why Metalhead sits as low as it does. Number 24, Black Museum. I know there's going to be a lot of people not happy with me putting Black Museum this low. And I would like to say this. Black Museum is an episode that upon first watch was very, very good and very, very fun. The more I watch it, the less I like it, and the less I like the technology and the concepts in the episode, and specifically the way the episode treats the stories that it's telling. Whereas another anthology episode in White Christmas, which we'll talk about later on in this video, gave us characters that were easy to follow and stories that were fun to watch and see play out, and then kind of gave us the moral quandary at the end of the episode. This episode doesn't really give us much in terms of likable stories or likable characters. Are you sick of me saying that yet? You probably should be. Letitia Wright's character, Niche, is the best part of this episode. But apart from her, every single one of these stories is filled with characters who are only there to get their comeuppance, or for us to kind of feel this awkward, should we feel bad for them, should we not feel bad for them kind of middle ground. And the way that it kind of laughs about these really horrific stories is done in a way that has never sit well with me, especially after my first viewing. I don't like Rolo Haynes as a character. I don't like all of the things that he does. I don't like the way he treats the other characters. But then at the same time, when the comeuppance comes at the end of the episode, it just feels like oh, okay. Like, we grow to hate him because of what Niche says about him and the technology that he presents about her father. And then when the museum burns down at the end and she drives off into the sunset, we're meant to feel like it's this huge happy moment. But then we got to keep in mind that her mom is still stuck in her head for eternity, and that's treated like this happy, successful moment. And for me, like I've talked about on this video before, especially me being religious, like that is a concept that just horrifies me. And I've never got behind it. It's the issues I have with San Junipero that we'll talk about later on in this video. As good of an episode as that is, the ending just doesn't sit well with me because that kind of eternity just doesn't mesh in a way that I feel is good. And so for me, that's why Black Museum sits as low as it does. Number 23, the national anthem. This is probably the hardest episode on this list to rank because if you've ever seen this episode, what do you say about it? Like, it's the episode with the pig. It's the first episode, which is the boldest possible choice this show ever could have made. I really like what this episode says about human greed, specifically human greed for publicity, and what people will do in any given situation, especially when time is not on the side of the protagonists. I think even with the kind of political aspect to this episode, the main characters are all semi-likable given the situations that they're in. I like the way this episode ends. I like what it says about human nature. But the overall concept is just so weird and so bizarre, it's just hard to put it any higher than this. It just is an episode that exists. It doesn't really say anything about technology, but I do like what it says about human nature. And so for me, it's hard to place this episode, and I think placing it here, even as low as this is on a list of 34 episodes, feels fair to me. Feel free to disagree in the comments section below. Number 22, Demon 79. This is a really fun episode, and the only reason I have it this low is because every time I've watched this, it just feels like this weird spin-off of Black Mirror that isn't actually a Black Mirror episode, but is still enjoyable in its own right. The reason it isn't any higher is because everything about this episode is wrapped in this air of nonsense. Did it happen? Did it not happen? And because of that, I don't know what to believe. I don't know who to believe. I don't know who to root for necessarily. And it's a fun romp, but it just feels really inconsequential and light compared to the rest of Black Mirror. And that's including the very, very heavy world-ending finish that this episode throws at us in a way that makes us wonder what we've just seen on screen. This episode has caused me a lot of issues for my Black Mirror timeline videos because of the fact that this episode gives us the end of the world, but it also takes place in the 70s. So it can't really fit on a timeline unless you discount the idea that any of this is actually happening. Which there's some merit to because Nita has all of these kind of machinations in her head about what's going on. I like the Boney M reference, apart from the fact that if you actually know what the band looks like, Papa Asiedu's character looks nothing like the lead singer of Boney M. So I always have to remove myself from it for that sake. But I enjoy this episode. It just doesn't give me enough substance to move up on my list, despite the fact that the more I watch it, the more I like it, and the more it continues to rise on my list. Number 21, White Bear. This may be my most controversial placement because a lot of people really, really like this episode. And I understand why, but having watched this episode multiple times, nothing has ever felt like the first time I watched it. The twist doesn't hit nearly as hard when you know what's going on. And because of that, like, all of the greatness of this episode sits in its twist. And once you lose that, and once you kind of go back and rewatch it, it doesn't fit as cohesively as I think the writers of this episode would have liked it to. It's a good episode. Season 2 is a fairly good season apart from the ending like we've already talked about. But like I said, when you put the context of the end of this episode into the beginning and rewatch it, you're just kind of waiting for the twist to happen. The story doesn't move in a way that is thrilling at all once you've finally figured out the twist. And so you're basically just waiting for that said twist to happen. And so for me, because the rewatch value on this episode is so low, all of the greatness is sucked away and it sits kind of middle tier of all these episodes. I don't think it's bad. I think there's merit to the twist. But like I said, it doesn't fit as cohesively as I would like it to, having gone back and watched it so many times since my first viewing. Number 20, Hated in the Nation. I believe this is still the longest episode of Black Mirror. Correct me if that's wrong nowadays, but Hated in the Nation is an episode that I think is hated more than it should be. I actually think this is a decent episode, and I like the story that it's trying to tell. I like the twist ending that brings us back to the beginning in a way that I think is more cohesive than something like White Bear. But because of its runtime, it really feels long. Its pacing is fine if you're into slower storytelling. I think the main characters are likable. The only thing I don't really care for in this episode, apart from just the overall huge length, is the way that it kind of undoes what the ending of these main characters is in the epilogue. We're kind of led to believe that with all of the horrific things going on and the thing that happened in the episode, the detective ended up disappearing and likely you-know-whatting herself off screen. And then we find out that she's on a hunt for revenge, and it leaves it ambiguous. And I don't care for that ending. Aside from that, I like all of the acting in this episode. I think the technology in this episode and the way that it's used is great. I love what this says about human nature. It's very similar to something like the national anthem in that way. And I think it's an underrated episode. But like I said, because it's so long and because there's so much in this episode that still finds a way to drag at certain moments, it has to sit this low. Number 19. Joan is awful. I actually don't mind this episode. A lot of people think it's the worst episode of season 6. I don't think so, necessarily. I think Joan is Awful is a fun story, especially when we get to the ending where everything meta just kind of falls apart. It's a really interesting look on world building and just kind of the creativity that we can get with meta narratives. I really like the way that it controls meta narratives, even if the concept of the metaverse is overdone nowadays. It wasn't necessarily when this episode came out, but now I think looking back on it 3 or 4 years later, things have kind of fallen apart in that realm, especially with what we've seen with the multiverse in the MCU. Fingers crossed that changes this December. But Joan is Awful is told from the perspective of a character who is instantly unlikable, and yet somehow, unlike all of the entries that I've complained about before, we are finding ways to cheer for her because of the way that the comedy aspect is wrapped into this episode. I think the comedy in this episode is done maybe the cleanest it's ever been done in Black Mirror. Of course, with all of the cameos and the way that it treats the cameos and the way that the cameos are built into the overall narrative, it tickles something in me that other episodes that do similar things don't. And I don't really know how to explain it better than that. And for me, that's why Joan is Awful is this high on my list compared to what most people rank it as significantly lower. I think it does the comedy very well. I think it does the meta-narrative very well. And I like the main characters, even when the story is trying to tell me that they're unlikable. Number 18. Bête Noire. This is another episode that is kind of a nothing burger in its overall concept. And the reason it's so high is because I like what it does with the technology involved. It takes that meta-narrative and really is Black Mirror's take on gaslighting. And I really like what it does with the story elements. I like the way it tricks our brain into paying attention. I like the way that it has that rewatch value that White Bear doesn't, because we have to go back and look for all of these different things to wonder, did we actually miss that? Are things actually changing, or are we just not paying attention? I really like the way that it treats its main character. I really like the dynamic between our two main characters, the protagonist and the antagonist. The only thing I don't care for with this episode is the ending and the way that it gives us this really ambiguous meta-narrative ending where all of a sudden she is the queen of the universe, and then it just ends. And it's like, well, where would the story go from here? Like, where does this concept go in nature? How do we get out of this ending? And so for me, the rushed ending and the way that the pacing just kind of accelerates at the end in a way that doesn't go anywhere has always felt odd. I say always as if this episode didn't just come out last year. Anyways, number 17, Hotel Reverie. I think the biggest issue with this episode is the acting. I'm not a huge fan of Issa Rae. I think whereas the comedy in some of the previous installments we've just talked about works for me, the comedy in this episode doesn't. And the awkward Awkwafina-ish comedy delivery, and it's not just from Awkwafina, it's from all of the characters in this episode. I'm not a fan of that kind of humor or that kind of comedic timing. And so because of that, all of the humor in this episode doesn't land, and it just takes away from what otherwise is supposed to be a very romantic, very feel-heavy episode. And so because of those two aspects, all of the other elements of this episode have kind of dropped for me. I like the concept, I like what it does with its visual style, I like the way that the characters interact with each other, and the way that it explores kind of this real versus fake narrative of identity. But beyond that, this episode's never really given me much to grasp onto because it's so detracted by the things that I've already complained about. Number 16, playtest. This is an episode where the more I watch it, the less I like it. It kind of feels like White Bear in the sense that that plot twist, or the multiple plot twists that happen in this episode, really hit hard the first time you watch it, and subsequently lose the feeling the more and more that you consume this episode. That being said, there's a lot to like about this episode. I really like the performances in it. I think all of the cast, for the most part, are pulling their weight. But things kind of fall apart the more that I think about the twists. It feels like the twists are kind of just there to give stakes to the overall story. There's a lot of weird horror elements that are fun upon first viewing, but the more you think about them at the end of the episode and as you watch the episode more, it doesn't quite mean as much as it did that first time. And so for me, the multiple endings as time goes on have felt more like a cop-out than an actual cohesive ending to the story. And I really think that the ending, especially the pun that they use at the end of the episode, feels a little too tacked on and ham-fisted for what I liked about it the first time I saw it. Number 15, Common People. I know this might be a low placement for Common People, and I used to actually have it lower. The more that I watch this episode, the more I do tend to like it. I think Rashida Jones is fantastic in the role. I think the overall story of this episode and the realism that it feels linked to our world and how likely of a future something like this could be, I think really gives this episode a depressing air of bringing Black Mirror into our immediate future the way that it used to do, and that it hasn't quite done in the way that it used to in subsequent years since. I think overall this is a great story. My main issues with it is it feels like the pacing of this episode isn't always as cohesive as I think the writing wants it to be. I think it feels like we're bouncing from one event to another without a cohesive story arc. And with that, I think there's some elements in this episode, such as the video camera ideas, that are done better in different episodes. But like I said, the more I watch this episode, the higher it goes in my list. Right now, based upon my most recent rewatch, it sits firmly in 15th place. Number 14, Beyond the Sea. Another episode that I like more the more time goes on. The biggest issue I have with this one, and the reason I don't think this is a masterpiece the way a lot of people do, and have since this episode came out, is I really struggle to feel the tension in this episode because it feels very predictable. And I know I'm saying that having watched it multiple times now, but even the first time I watched it, the ending of this episode and the way that it treats the ending as such a massive, massive dark twist has always to me felt like that was going to be the ending. Upon first watching of this episode, once we get past the big twist at the beginning of the episode, it always felt like something was going to mirror it at the end of the episode. And I knew that was either going to be an affair where he kills him in the spaceship, or he does what he eventually does, and I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't watched the episode. But for me, my biggest issue has always felt like this story is way too predictable, and it treats it like it's this major, major twist, but it's really not. And so for me, it kind of has this air of self-congratulation that I've always felt was a little unearned. But like I said, I continue to like this episode more, I continue to like the performances more, and I like the way that the actors are playing multiple roles in the different body double scenes. But beyond that, I still think this episode sits in 14th place. Number 13, White Christmas. I'm going to keep repeating myself to the point that you're going to be bored of me saying this, but this is an episode where I like it less the more time goes on, and I think the reason for that is the more I watch it, the less I sympathize with these main characters because I know all of the things that they have done. And to the episode's credit, it treats the main characters like likable people and tries to get us to side with one or the other, or even both at times when we're learning about their respective backstories. But both of the main characters are very despicable people the more that you look into it, and their stories really leave a bad taste in your mouth, especially the ending, and it kind of congratulates itself for its ending, much like I talked about in previous installments, where this whole eternity wrapped in the enigma of technology is this kind of bittersweet ending where he gets his freedom, but he's never allowed to talk to another human being again because of the technology in place. It really leaves this odd, like, purgatorial feel in my bones every time I watch this episode, and it never sits right with me, which might be the point, but for me, when I'm watching these episodes, as much as I like kind of the twist, gross, creep-out endings at times, this episode is never one that I like rewatching because I know how I feel at the ending of the episode. Number 12, Crocodile. To the opposite extent, this episode makes me feel bad at the end of the episode, but it does so in a way that treats itself grossly funny, and I really like the way it does it. This episode knows that it is very, very dark, but at the same time, darkly humorous. And despite the darkness of the episode and the incredible directing and the bleakness of this episode, I really like the tone of it. As someone who has been to Iceland multiple times and has been to a number of the locations in this episode, I've always related to this episode in a very weird way in terms of, not that I've ever been in the situation that any of these main characters are in, but I can see this episode and understand why the story is progressing and why this character is falling into the path that she is falling in because of the decisions that she's making and the failure to take accountability for her actions, leading to this massive, massive plot dive where we essentially kill an entire family because she can't take responsibility for her own actions. It's an incredible story. The only things I don't like about this episode are, like I said, kind of the weirdness of it. It's not for everybody. It's not a great episode, but it's well enough that I enjoy it every time I watch it. I think it's grossly funny. I think it's a really tragic ending in a way that is enjoyable on rewatch because you can pick out little things that you didn't notice before, and I think it firmly sits where I have it placed on the list. Number 11, 15 Million Merits. This episode is one that I really liked the first time I saw it. And then as time went on, I didn't like it as much. And then as time goes on, again, it's kind of reworked its way to the top. I think the performances in this episode are great. I think the world building, despite kind of the minimalism of the world in this episode, is great. And like I talked about a few installments ago with Common People, this feels like a future that is not far off from ours. It feels like the selling out for the sake of personal indulgences, for the sake of personal pleasure, is something that a lot of people are falling into with the way that technology is progressing and the way that the society as a whole is progressing with mega corporations taking over our world in reality. I really like the main characters. I like the pacing of this episode. I like the progression of this episode. The only issues I really do have with it are how much time is spent taken up in the shows themselves. I think all of the side characters are extremely dislikable and at the same time very forgettable. I think the judges and the main characters are great, but I wish the world building was slightly more expansive, and I know, like I said, that kind of contradicts my idea with the whole minimalist aesthetic. Apart from the bleakness of this episode, I think the ending is fantastic. I think it's got this bleakness to it that is very realistic. But for me, there's a bunch of episodes that are better than it, and that's why it sits as low as it does. Number 10, Shut Up and Dance. I think anything that Alex Lawler touches is fantastic. This episode is one where, like Crocodile, things just keep happening because people don't take accountability for their actions. And the actions that they're not taking accountability in this episode for, specifically with Kenny, the main character, just are so beyond what we expect them to be that by the time we get to the major reveal at the end of the episode where we find out what he's actually been doing, it hits you like a ton of bricks to the point where you have to rewatch the entire episode with this whole new lens because this main character is not the innocent child who has done something that we've all been guilty of at one point or another and has fallen into this bad trap. This is a horrible person who has been caught doing horrible things and is being taken advantage of by horrible people in a way that is grossly funny. I think this episode, the tone is fantastic. The chemistry between the two main characters is great. The overall plot and the way that the plot progresses is great. The pacing is probably the best pacing of any Black Mirror episode. And for me, that's why it sits as high as it does. But the only reason it's not higher is because, like I said, I think looking back on this episode, the dislikability of the main characters taints it slightly. The issue with Black Mirror, as you're kind of finding out by my rankings, is certain episodes age better than others the more that you watch them. Not because of when they came out or anything, but certain things are written in ways that make you feel certain ways about characters, and that changes as you revisit some of these episodes. So for me, because of the grossness and the dislikability of the main characters, the more I watch this, the lower it falls on my list. Number 9, Loch Henry. I still have recency bias about this episode, even though it's been about 3 years since this episode came out, and I understand that this is not a very popular opinion. I really like Loch Henry. I really like the way the story progresses. I even like the ending with the girlfriend's death. The biggest thing I like about this episode in comparison to episodes I've mentioned before, like White Christmas or White Bear, or things with the big twists at the end like Beyond the Sea, is this episode doesn't congratulate itself for its twist ending. This episode accepts its twist. You can kind of foreshadow the twist and see it going forward, but the story progresses in a way that doesn't feel tacked on and self-congratulatory for it. And the way that this episode ends with the death and the overall storytelling of this episode being congratulated at an awards show, and the way that that parodies just kind of the way true crime has been tainted, especially nowadays when we get into like the AI verse of real crime. That wasn't even something that existed when this episode came out, or at least not to the extent that it does now on YouTube with artificial intelligent made storytelling. It's got this weird modernist aesthetic that when you look back on this episode and see the progression of the story, it moves in a way that is predictable, but at the same time, you're not sure if they're going to commit to its predictability. And the way that then it shifts that slightly, I have always really appreciated. I like the twists in this episode. I like the tone of this episode. I like the way it treats its main characters. And I really like the ending of this episode. The only reason it's not higher is for all of the issues that people have pointed out with it. It has a weird ending. And to a lot of people, they don't think it fits. I personally tend to disagree. And overall, it is somewhat forgettable. And I think that's its biggest issue, is the main characters, as likable as I think they are, and the chemistry that they have, I think, is great given the tone of the story. I don't think it's that memorable of an episode. So for me, that's why it sits as low as it does, despite how much I like it. Number 8, Hang the DJ. This is one of those rare Black Mirror episodes with a happy ending. And similar to the previous installment that we just talked about, I think this is one of the more forgettable episodes in Black Mirror, simply because the overall story of it and the ending does feel very similar to San Junipero, which has for years been the happy ending episode of Black Mirror. It is very different. I don't want to say that the two episodes are super similar in that many ways, but in terms of digital dating and the happy ending, it feels like because this one came second, it has always fallen into San Junipero's shadow. I really like the main characters. I really like the way that it plays with relationships and human connections. But for me, because of the forgettableness of this episode and the way that, as much as I do like it, I think there are plenty more episodes better than it, I can't put it any higher. Number 7, San Junipero. This has always been my most controversial take. Now, granted, this episode was not made for someone like me, so I totally understand disagreements with my perspective on it. My biggest issue has always been, and this is my personal opinion and personal beliefs, as someone who believes in an afterlife and puts a lot of my faith in an afterlife, the idea of a technological eternity has always sat with me in a really gross way. The idea that there is no happiness beyond the happiness that we feel on Earth, and the boredom that we can feel on Earth and being trapped in that for a digital eternity has never sat well with me. I also don't like the way that this episode ends in terms of the way that its characters feel like they kind of change their mind at the last sec. Kelly especially, her character progression, as great as her backstory is, Kelly's decision to stay just changes randomly. And as great as this ending is, as memorable as this episode probably has the best aesthetics and memorability of any episode in Black Mirror. Those two elements for me are why I can't put it in the very top of my personal list. Number 6, Nosedive. Before she was acting on Black Mirror, Rashida Jones actually wrote an episode for Black Mirror, and it's this one. And if you're a fan of Parks and Rec, you can tell. I'm a huge Bryce Dallas Howard fan. I think she's fantastic in everything she touches. This episode is probably the greatest example of when I first watched this episode, I didn't like it that much, and now, having watched it multiple times over multiple years, I think this is one of the best episodes of Black Mirror. I think the world building and the way that it establishes its world is fantastic. I think the aesthetics of this episode, as kind of gross as they are, if in terms of that pastel aesthetic, are super memorable and done in an incredible way, especially when we get to kind of the dark, grimy parts of this episode. The way that it treats its characters, the way that it plays on the idea of social credit and social media presence and influencers as a whole, and kind of predicted the way that the 2010s would fall into the 2020s, is fantastic. I really like the dynamics between the main characters, and the fake fragility that they have between each other is done in a way that feels very realistic to our world in like multiple episodes we've talked about before, something that feels very near in the future. I love the performances of this. I love the progression of this episode. The only reason it's not higher is because I really love the top 5 on my list even more than Nosedive. This is a great episode. I don't want to sell it short at all. Here to the very top are all personal preference, so that's why it sits in 6th place. Number 5, USS Callister, Into Infinity. When they announced they were doing a sequel to one of the best regarded episodes in Black Mirror history, I, like many fans, was very, very cautiously pessimistic. I was fearful that it was going to destroy the legacy of the original episode, and as someone who, the first USS Callister, that was the first episode I ever saw of Black Mirror, I feel a lot of things for that episode and have a lot of nostalgia for it. What Into Infinity is able to do is not only expand that world in a way that is almost entirely satisfactory, it gives so much depth and backstory to the characters that it helps you re-watch that episode in an entirely new light and almost makes the original USS Callister better because of what Into Infinity does. All of the characters progress in a way that I think is natural. The way that it revisits the dynamic between Walton and Robert Daly is fantastic. The way that it uses him as kind of this god character that they have to find in order to destroy the world, and the way that he falls back into the evil tendencies that we saw in the previous episode. Everything about this, like I said, just adds more to the original in a way that benefits the original. And for me, it is one of the best possible sequels to any Black Mirror episode. They knocked it out of the park with this one. I still like the original better, but for me, this is almost a perfect episode of Black Mirror. Number 4, USS Callister. Like I said, my top 5 are entirely personal preference, and like I just talked about with Into Infinity, USS Callister was the first episode of Black Mirror I ever watched, to the point that once I got done, I didn't know that the rest of the series was going to be different than kind of the Star Trek futuristic. I had no idea what I was getting into. My brother showed me the episode for the first time right after it came out. I was very impressed, and obviously it stuck with me to the point that this channel got popular because of Black Mirror. I really do like the Star Trek aesthetics. I like the way that it plays into the different character roles and the character dynamics. I like the way that it uses toxic masculinity in the way that it does, and the way that it's expanded on in the sequel, like we just talked about, just creates this whole new essence of this is what happens when you take someone who is a detriment to society but stays quiet, and you give them the power to become that monster that they were always destined to be. It's done in a really, really fantastic way. It's one of the best looking episodes of Black Mirror. It's one of the most memorable episodes of Black Mirror, rivaling maybe only San Junipero. And the only reason it's not higher for me is because all of the episodes above this fit into the character growth and establishment archetype that I really like for my Black Mirror episodes. This is fantastic. I would say this is a perfect episode of Black Mirror, but for me, personal preference puts it in 4th place. Number 3, The Entire History of You. This is one of the hardest episodes for me to rewatch simply because the first time that I watched this episode, I was going through something, I shouldn't say similar to the main characters, but I had a lot of anxieties about a situation similar to what was happening in the episode, to the point that it was hard for me to get over my personal connection to the episode and watch it from an objective standpoint. I've watched it a few times since, and it still just hits that chord in me that just causes so much anxiety about the what if. It takes just this slight interaction that feels just a hair off and blows it up to the point that you have no idea if the main character is telling the truth about what he believes, is going to be right about what he believes. And the fact that it gives us that satisfaction just blows this entire story out of proportion. It's probably the saddest episode of Black Mirror in terms of what it does to its main characters and how simple the story is in a way that is realistic to our own world and doesn't feel like the technology is way too blown out of proportion like some later episodes. I really like the simplicity of it despite the complexity of the technology. I really like the performances in this episode. Toby Kebbell is great, and especially the pairing with Jodie Whittaker I think is fantastic. I wish Jodie Whittaker would have been as good in Doctor Who as she is in this episode because she is fantastic. I don't have a ton more that I can say about this episode. I really, really enjoy it. It just hits me every single time I watch it in a way that just tugs at my heartstrings and wish that things could have been different for these characters. Number 2. Eulogy. Much in the same vein, Eulogy touches my heart in the opposite direction. The ending isn't one that I would call a happy ending, but it at least gives some semblance of closure to a character who has really been bottling up a struggle for decades of his life. This tells the story of a character who is broken by a past relationship, not just by his own hand, but significantly caused and damaged by his own hand. And when she dies and he has to revisit her life, or at least chooses to revisit parts of her life and the parts of his life that he spent with her, it helps him come to a feeling of closure, a sense of just finality with this brokenness that he's been holding on to basically his entire life, and helps open up his misery in a way that makes him into a new person by the end of the episode. And I think that's why this episode feels so happy at the end, because despite all the tragedy and despite all the sadness that we experience in this episode, we get to a point of newness. And I really like that about this episode. It explores humanity in a way that is hopeful. And I don't feel that with a lot of Black Mirror, especially even my first pick. I feel like this is the most hopeful for humanity that Black Mirror has ever been. And it touches upon all of the human relationship elements that I like in my episodes of Black Mirror. The only reason it's not top spot is personal preference. It honestly might overtake the top spot as time goes on, but having only watched this episode 2 times, it sits firmly in second place, second only to number 1, Be Right Back. This episode has everything. It has the weird futuristic technology. It has the weird over-reliance on technology. It has the human element and trying to replace human connection with technology in a way that is taken to such an extent that I don't know if Black Mirror can ever reach the simplicity and the highs that this episode provides. Josh Allen's girlfriend is fantastic in this episode, and her chemistry with Domhnall Gleeson in both the first part of this episode and the way that he reappears in this episode as the clone version of Ash is done in such a way and performed in such a way that feels so empty and longing. And despite the dysfunction that we have at the beginning of the episode, there's a realness to it that the perfection of the later half of the episode doesn't have, and it makes us long for the sense of fighting, the sense of imperfection, the sense of realness in human connection that makes human romance and human relationships so much greater than anything we could replace in our own personal fantasy. I think the simplicity of the technology, the way that it feels not too far off from our own future, is something that makes Black Mirror the best that it can be in terms of a technology future show. The way that we get the ending where the main character can't decide what she wants to do and leaves it up to the synthetic replica to do to himself feels like a lack of closure that is realistic to the characters and the way that they're being portrayed. And I've always felt like this episode takes everything I love about Black Mirror and just elevates it to the next level. It's got Josh Allen's girlfriend. She's fantastic in this role. And for me, if I had to give it a rating, I would give it 11 stars out of 10. It is that good. I love it that much. The only one that I think even comes close is Eulogy, and like I said, these two may go back and forth in the future, but upon first watch and having felt this way ever since, Be Right Back has always topped my list for Black Mirror episodes. So let me know what your ranking of all the Black Mirror episodes are in the comments below. If this is something you're interested in learning more about or just exploring on the channel, we do have an entire timeline of Black Mirror where I tried to go through every episode and place it on a linear timeline. You can check that out in the corner above my head. You can also like, share, subscribe, and join the Patreon if you feel so inclined. Otherwise, we'll hope to see you back on the channel very, very soon.